Hey everyone, welcome to part 2 of this video series of my reading of my essay, The Metaphysical Case for Love. Before we get started, a bit of a housekeeping introduction, let's say. The playlist for this video series, I'll leave a link to that in the description down below, simply because I can't read the whole essay in one video because it's 15,000 words. I'm breaking it down into a few sections. Also, this part is Love is Pouring from an Empty Cup, and I use the ideas of course, Jacques Lacan, Peter Rollins, and Byung-Chul Han. But on top of that, my reading of Lacan was through Dr. Grace Tapley, her paper, Lacan's Psychoanalytical Way of Love. And fortunately, I managed to have her on my podcast and have a conversation with her. So if you do want to go watch that, I'll leave a link to that in the description down below too. It was a very, very enlightening, soul-edifying conversation, and it's really thanks to her that I really understood the idea of lack and how it relates to love, apropos Lacan. Saying all that, let's get started. This is part 2 of my essay. Well, it's not really part 2 of the essay, but of the video series, let's say. And it's titled, as I said, Love is Pouring from an Empty Cup. We live in an achievement society. To paraphrase Peter Rollins qua Byung-Chul Han, today's religion is that of pure positivity. Contrary to the psychoanalytic insight, society tells us wrongly we are not castrated subjects. Footnote. In classical Freudian theory, the castration complex is the anxiety caused for the subject, that's in effect you and I, by the fear of emasculation. Despite the masculinized terminology, this is experienced by men, women, and other subjects, albeit differently. It always encompasses a constitutive lack or loss, although for Lacanians in particular, castration occurs when we enter the symbolic world of language and sacrifice our jouissance to the big other, the field of signification, e.g. sociopolitical law, culture, etc. As Žižek writes, this gap between my direct psychological identity and my symbolic identity, the symbolic mask or the title I wear, defining what I am for and in the big other, is what Lacan calls symbolic castration with the phallus as its signifier. And we are but subjects the moment we become social creatures due to what we lose, although that which is lost doesn't exist but is something the subject unconsciously fantasizes was taken from him or her at castration. Žižek continues, this is what the infamous symbolic castration means. The castration which occurs by the very fact of me being caught in the symbolic order, assuming a symbolic mask or title. Castration is a gap between what I immediately am and the symbolic title which confers on me a certain status and authority. Peter Rollins interprets castration via a theological lens, provocatively saying, the psychoanalytic answer to the question, is there life after death, is yes. We are the evidence. To be alive is to be castrated, to have actually passed through death. Weirdly, psychoanalysis proves the existence of life after death, because to be a subject is to be marked by death, by a fundamental loss. End footnote. The insistence is we have no lack or symbolic debt, and if we do, we must immediately rectify this error via self-help, therapy, psychedelics, etc. The moral imperative is we must be whole, complete, fulfilled, etc. So we are told we can and must have everything and be our best selves. No wonder then we are in productivity and life hack mania, where one is trying to be an entrepreneur of the self. In that vein, isn't the modern rise of Stoicism and New Age pseudo-spirituality unsurprising? It's the perfect ideological supplement for the worship of the self. And yet, phantasmatic egoism inevitably leads to one being a good, subservient consumer partaking in the web of ideology. Since the religious dogma of postmodern culture is a commandment to be happy, the tyranny of happiness or the tyranny of self-love in New Ageism is the ideal commodity today with all its metaphysical subtleties and theological niceties. Amidst such an ideological edifice, it's common to hear the colloquialism, "You cannot pour from an empty cup," regarding relationships, romantic or otherwise. Within the context of love, this apparently means you won't have the necessary vitality to do the work of love and care for another person if you don't take care of yourself first. Of course, like all uncritical preconceptions, there's an element of truth to this notion. For a relationship to last, the two people involved must have a certain level of time and energy to do the work of love. But having said that, such a pragmatic view firstly misses the nature of an authentic love event. It's not something one could perfectly plan for because it is something without precedent, something that emerges as if from nothing, but is nonetheless imminent and urgent. And more radically, love is giving what you don't have. For Lacan, the essence of love is accepting a lack in the other, your partner, because the other will, to paraphrase Dr. Grace Tarpey, recognize their lack and give it to you while you give yours to them. Footnote. The core of what we are is a void, something traumatically missing, which is what makes us human beings desiring creatures. But we desire something that doesn't exist substantially. For Lacanians, an objet petit a, or objet a, translated directly to object small a in English. The objet petit a is a void or lack you unconsciously pursue in the hope that the attainment of this missing part of yourself will give you an ontological completeness. Michael Downs. Our desire is caused by this constitutive lack, or in French, manque. That is, we are beings that are always lacking, ergo always desiring. Although what we lack isn't something with positive content, i.e. more money, traveling, intimate relationships, gold, etc. Rather, the lack itself is the object that doesn't exist, objet a, emerges as the remainder of the very operation of castration, an object which fills in the lack opened up by castration. An object which is nothing but this lack itself acquiring a positive form. Desire without lack cannot exist. So to understand what lack entails, one ought to look at how desire makes us act in our life world, once socially, culturally, or evolutionarily established network of meaning. Capitalism is ideal to exemplify this phenomenon, as it functions primarily because of the desire caused by our lack. As Tom McGowan writes, capitalism has the effect of sustaining subjects in a constant state of desire. As subjects of capitalism, we are constantly on the edge of having our desire realized, but never reach the point of realization. This has the effect of producing a satisfaction that we don't recognize as such. That is, capitalist subjects experience satisfaction itself as dissatisfying, which enables them to simultaneously enjoy themselves and believe wholeheartedly that a more complete satisfaction exists just around the corner, embodied in the newest commodity. Since our lack is unfulfillable and our desire is unmeetable, we are the perfect subjects for capitalist dynamics because paradoxically, capitalism works by not working. We are always kept on the edge of having our desires met by, in fact, not having them met in reality. All of these ideological machinations are thanks to a constitutive lack. End footnote. Such is why you cannot love the perfect person, nor can you be the perfect person for another. Love is found precisely in the lack of two castrated people, which they see in each other, and at times traumatically, they see their own lack reflected through their lover. So the aforementioned work of love, integral to any relationship, lies in working through this lack with each other. To reiterate, traumatic is the apt term to describe working through each other's lack, because it goes beyond narcissistic love, the desire to be desired, the most common kind, into confronting the real of you and your partner, which most people fail to do, ergo needing help from a third party like a psychotherapist or some relationships ending altogether. Footnote. Žižek succinctly explains the real as that which resists symbolization. But he annotates this explanation saying, if I just say this, you understand it in a purely abstract way. In a way, it means nothing. Because the real isn't a positive entity that merely resists symbolization, but appears as an antagonism and chromatic split in our symbolic order, the linguistic and psychosocial reality in which we participate, regardless of if we believe in it or not, to render meaning to our lives via customs, institutions, laws, mores, norms, practices, rituals, rules, traditions, etc. of culture and society. So the real can only be seen when there's a break in the symbolic order. As Žižek writes, for Lacan, the real, at its most radical, has to be totally desubstantialized. It is not an external thing that resists being caught in the symbolic network, but the fissure within the symbolic network itself. In a romantic relationship, the real would be if you come home one day and find your partner in bed with someone else. The split of what you thought you had, a committed relationship, gives rise to what was behind the veil. Although this does not mean that the veil wasn't true, and what actually entails your relationship is infidelity, lies, etc. And now you've seen the reality of things. In fact, thinking that you've taken the proverbial red pill and now know the truth, would be part of the illusion itself. Such is why the real is never substantialized into a symbolic object, i.e., it appears only in the contradiction of what you thought your relationship was and seeing your partner cheating on you, which could then lead you to excavate what was repressed in your partner and yourself, leading to this event, or not. End footnote. But true love invariably moves from love in terms of a narcissistic image, as Dr. Grace Tarpley states in Lacan's psychoanalytic way of love. The narcissistic image is where love is an image that substantializes one's ego ideal. That is, one wants to be loved, and the lover is placed in the position of the ideal ego. Footnote. Žižek states, ideal ego stands for the idealized self-image of the subject, the way I would like to be, the way I would like others to see me. Ego ideal is the agency whose gaze I try to impress with my ego image, the big other, who watches over me and impels me to give my best, the ideal I try to follow and actualize. Ideal ego is imaginary, what Lacan calls small other, the idealized mirror image of my ego. Ego ideal is symbolic, the point of my symbolic identification, the point in the big other from which I observe and judge myself. There's a distinction between ideal ego and ego ideal. For instance, Andy Bernard at Helms from The Office, the American version, portrays these concepts and their differences conspicuously. When introduced in season 3, he's an annoyingly narcissistic character, mainly due to how his ideal self at work is shown. Most of his introduction is a farcical rivalry with Dwight Schrute, Rainn Wilson, in an attempt to gain favor with the manager Michael Scott, Steve Carell. His tactics to win favor and social standing as a newcomer amongst his colleagues is the ideal ego, pulling him towards an idealized image of what he ought to be amidst the other. In contrast, Michael acts as an instantiation of the big other that Andy obsequiously tries to please. Although, as we, the viewer, knows Michael's impotence as the big other always is in the real. In this case, Michael is Andy's ego ideal, whose gaze he tries to impress with his ego image. Unlike the other, the rest of Andy's milieu, Michael represents a self-relating entity distinct from Andy, yet he unconsciously knows it has authority over him. Having said that, in true love, one has to always move from the ideal to the real, for love to keep realizing. To paraphrase Todd McGowan, when falling in love, one shouldn't fall into a comfy couch and lie there like a slope, but keep falling with your partner. As Rainer Murray Rilke writes, to be loved means to be consumed by fire. To love is giving light with inexhaustible oil, To be loved is to pass away. To love is to endure. End footnote. In moving from unilateral solipsistic love, the lovers encounter the real. Beyond the narcissistic relationship towards the love object, Lacan later in his work shows that we need to encounter the real, the traumatic object in the subject. Thus, true love aims at the kernel of the real. Those who say they need to pour into their cup and take care of themselves first, that is, trying to fill their unfulfillable lack, are hiding their egoism behind the sensible care for their partner. Footnote. Egotism is not necessarily bad. In fact, to do the work of love, one needs a sense of self, perhaps even an overinflated one at times to believe one is lovable. Because authentic love never entails two becoming one in the sense that the two disintegrate as individual egos, but, to paraphrase Alain Bajot, the two remain two in their infinite subjectivities while simultaneously experiencing a disjuncture in their experience. Such is why love is hard, because if two become one, there wouldn't be any otherness to your lover, and the relationship would simply be a peculiar kind of self-love. Thus, egotism is needed to understand that one's lover is separate from you and vice versa. Furthermore, it's infinitely better to be an egoist with the concomitant flaws than to embody false and duplicitous humility. End footnote. For instance, when the bourgeois businessman justifies his desire to become wealthy, he usually says, "I'm doing it for my family." And yet the more money he makes, the more his desires grow, i.e. he wants a bigger house, better car, etc., or simply more money for the sake of it, as he ultimately desires the objet A. Footnote. For Lacanians, the objet petit a, or objet A for short, is not an object with any substantial positive characteristics. So it's not a physical object like a tree or smartphone subject to empiricism, nor an abstract mathematical object, i.e. numbers, sets, etc. Žižek characteristically demonstrates the workings of the objet A with a Jewish joke. To paraphrase one, the Jew is treated as a sublime object by anti-Semites. That is, the Jew is elevated to something more than what they are with the typical anti-Semitic tropes, e.g., the Jews control the weather, own the media and banks, and more recently are globalists, etc. So a Jewish person could play a good practical joke on an anti-Semite. Let's say they come across one who's openly anti-Semitic and confronts the Jew inquiring how, quote-unquote, their kind have all this power. He could reply, "I'll show you, but you must pay me a fee first." And after receiving the money, he could continue making up some nonsense like, "First you take a dead fish, you cut off her head and put her entrails in a glass of water. Then, around midnight, when the moon is full, you must bury this glass in a churchyard." Until the anti-Semite eventually realizes he's being fooled and that there is no secret at all. You, the Jewish person, simply wants to extract the last and small coin from me. While this joke shows the absurdity of anti-Semitism, Žižek theorizes with it how an anti-Semite is a quintessential example of the objet A operating. The fascinating secret which drives us to follow the Jew's narration carefully is precisely the Lacanian objet petit a, the chimerical object of fantasy, the object causing our desire, and at the same time, this is its paradox, posed retroactively by this desire. In going through the fantasy, we experience how this fantasy object, the secret, only materializes the void of our desire. Lack is what causes the objet A to come into being, although it's not causal where our inherent lack causes the objet A to exist with a positive substance similar to how things apparently work in the physical universe, but it exists purely as a positive negativity, a substantial void, a reified emptiness, as Michael Down states. It can't exist without the subject's desire, nor can desire exist without it. So it's retroactively posed as we desire our lost enjoyment, which never existed in the first place, but we nonetheless hope to attain it in hopes of completeness. For instance, I recall a conversation I had with a friend I met when on holiday in New Zealand who was backpacking, and after spending almost a year on the road, she headed back to Germany, her home. She now tells me that when traveling after some time, she keeps thinking of resting and heading home or going to another place, whereas when back home, she wants to once again travel to another country. The proverbial travel bug is an ideal example of the objet A in action. What we desire is never the city or country itself, no matter how beautiful or exotic the destination may be, but always something more, something in excess that we enjoy purely in the pursuit. And this excessive enjoyment or surplus jouissance is what the non-existing objet A gives us. So we always enjoy dreaming of traveling to a variety of places than actually doing it, because the moment we arrive somewhere, the objet A moves elsewhere along with our desires. A case in point, Paris syndrome. End footnote. Instead of living below his means, the family becomes the masquerade and, at its worst, the scapegoat for his financial pursuits. Camus says it best. A man wants to earn money in order to be happy, and his whole effort and the best of a life are devoted to the earning of that money. Happiness is forgotten. The means are taken for the end. The myth of Sisyphus. In Vince Gilligan's Breaking Bad, when Walter White, Bryan Cranston, discovers his cancer and starts committing crimes, from building a drug empire to the numerous murders he carries out, he justifies his acts by repeatedly stating he's doing it for his family. But towards the end of the show, he finally confesses to his estranged wife, Skylar, and our gun, the truth we, the viewer, already knew, saying,
Skylar, all the things that I did, you need to understand.
I have to hear one more time that you did this for the family.
I did it for me. I liked it. I was good at it. And I was really I was alive.
The usual take on the series is 1. The political commentary of the failing American healthcare system that leads a man with cancer to sell meth to pay for his treatment, and 2. How it depicts the descent of Walt from an ostensibly harmless high school chemistry teacher to a ruthless drug kingpin. But a psychoanalytical analysis reveals that, contrary to the view that a show like Breaking Bad could only be made in America, as most other countries have universal healthcare, Walt was already the man that let Jane, Kristen Ritt's, Jesse's, Aaron Paul's girlfriend, die by overdosing on heroin from the beginning. He was already the criminal we thought he became by sheer circumstance. Walt had missed out on an opportunity to become wealthy by selling his financial interest early on in Grey Matter Technologies, a company he co-founded with Elliot Schwartz, Adam Godley. At the time, he also dated his lab assistant Gretchen Schwartz, Jessica Hetch, who Elliot later married and made a fortune of Walt's research. So his life was subsumed by the envy of his lost jouissance, along with his repressed resentment towards Elliot and Gretchen. Footnote. Žižek writes, although jouissance can be translated as enjoyment, translators of Lacan often leave it in French in order to render palpable its excessive, properly traumatic character. We are not dealing with simple pleasures, but with a violent intrusion that brings more pain than pleasure. This is how we usually perceive the Freudian superego, The cruel and sadistic ethical agency which bombards us with the impossible demands and then gleefully observes our failure to meet them. No wonder then that Lacan posited an equation between jouissance and superego. To enjoy is not a matter of following one's spontaneous tendencies. It is rather something we do as a kind of weird and twisted ethical duty. For Lacanians, pleasure always is connected to pain. Thus, jouissance, untranslated into English, ensures it's not perceived as only a pleasurable evolutionary drive to eat, sleep, reproduce, etc. In fact, our libidinal jouissance denaturalizes us as subjects, because we're biological beings who are animals that nonetheless fall outside the category of the animal. Findings of psychoanalysis exemplify this phenomena best. For instance, if a person tirelessly works on a vocation they love, e.g. being a writer, scientist, engineer, etc., their happiness and well-being are often sacrificed for their work. As the colloquialism goes, they lose themselves in the act. When you're deeply passionate about a craft, there's always an element of self-destructiveness it entails. Humans acting in such a way is antithetical to the behaviorist theories that are voguish in pop psychology today, where human and non-human agents act solely on positive or negative stimuli, emotions, mental states, etc. While B.F. Skinner can explain how mice and pigeons act in certain ways, his theories cannot account for jouissance, the excessive violence we impose on ourselves when, to use the above example, we quite literally work ourselves to death. Jouissance, though, is not always connected to one's motivation to work, because one could always argue that by engaging deeply in a vocation one loves, we find a quote-unquote higher pleasure in the pain of sacrifice. Perhaps this is true, but it still doesn't explain how jouissance manifests in other peculiar ways, which can be found by psychoanalysts. For instance, when Pink sings,
"At the same time, I wanna hug you, I wanna wrap my hands around your neck. You're an asshole, but I love you, and you made me so mad I ask myself why I'm still here, or where could I go? You're the only love I've ever known, but I hate you, I really hate you so much I think it must be true love, it must be true love."
That's because of jouissance. Most relationships work not because two people are perfectly compatible, but instead because they find pleasure in the discomfort of their incompatibilities. The tiny flaws and imperfections are what allows two people to be romantically involved. Of course, this can certainly manifest in pathological ways where people stay in abusive and destructive relationships. In any case, how jouissance manifests in us positively or negatively doesn't invalidate its reality that makes humans unnatural beings. Why do wage laborers who hate their job and dread working endlessly for simple survival keep working apart from the rare protest or outburst of violence? Why does the working class, regardless of one being blue, white, or pink collar workers, seemingly act against their self-interest, succumbing to the exploitations of capitalism? Why do people complain about the current socioeconomic conditions yet not partake in political movements attempting to change them? You could thank jouissance for that, because it makes us act against our self and class interests. Indeed, jouissance is what lets people participate as agents of capital in an inherently exploitative market economy that we all consciously know isn't working. So we need to analyze society by incorporating the findings of psychoanalysis into economics and sociology. As Michael Downs states, Marx's biggest error was underestimating how much human beings actually enjoy acting against their own self-interest, pleasure, due to the workings of their drives, jouissance. This intrinsic antagonism of wage labor plays itself out, psychoanalytically speaking, in the fantasy space of the workers as they compute, gauge, and tally up how much jouissance their co-workers are unjustifiably enjoying, at their expense based on their level of productivity. Liberally speaking, to be a wage laborer is to scapegoat all other wage laborers. Now, the reason why this is an inherent transgression and an ideological obfuscation is due to how it keeps wage laborers from ever focusing on the even greater antagonism, i.e., the one between labor and capital. End footnote. The fact that he refused any help from the Gretchens when they offered to fully pay for his treatment further highlights that his cancer and the quest to ensure his family's financial security were the masquerade used for him to regain his lost jurisdictions via transgressions. The point is the transgressions. His crimes were not a means to an end. Accordingly, the obsessive businessman is no different to Walt. The content of his jurisdictions may not be as violent and as transgressive as Walt's, but the form is similar. So, he ought to admit that he's relentlessly expanding his business for himself because he also is pursuing what Walt did, the unattainable objet art. Yet only in love is the truth of one's desires confronted, as we give our lover the proverbial empty cup, the aforementioned lack. And in this romantic act, we discover that in love, we have nothing to give because, to paraphrase Alain Bajou, love hangs on nothing.